Sometimes I hear my mother or father's voice come out of my mouth, right? I say words that I swore I'd never say, such as because I said so, right? Almost never say this, but like it's come out of my mouth a few times. I'm like, whoa, I promised I'd never say that. I don't believe that. Why did I say that? This is unconscious words, right? Means some other part of my trauma or conditioning is taken over. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father.
We are dedicated.
Hey, Dedicators. I am back to talk about what I think is one of the most important topics, one of the biggest opportunities and also biggest challenges of being a parent. And that is that fact that we are the first generation to be reparenting ourselves, our own inner children, while also parenting our actual children. We're not just trying to do things a little bit better than our parents. We are trying to change the whole mold, like do this way differently and heal our own selves in the process. So this is a really big challenge, but 100% true for my wife and I. Our journey of, reparenting began before we had kids. Della really became a huge motivation to do it more, but also uh, uh, impossible to hide. Like she just put it all right in front of us. So we really don't want to pass that on to her. So we were really passionate about healing this and becoming way different parents. But it also just brings up all my unresolved shit all the time. And I'm sure if you have kids, you know this happens. So here we are. My wife and I were sleep deprived. We're figuring out how to have a new baby. We're running a company, and we both are having our childhood wounds triggered on a regular basis all at once, right? I'm sure it sounds familiar for you. So first, you got to have compassion for that, right? This is really hard. There's absolutely no way to do this perfect. There's just too many things to handle to be perfect. So just got to take it as it comes and do your best. Doing things perfect was something both my wife and I learned from our parents, so that perfectionism is something that has to be undone, especially because being a parent, because there's no great way to do it. So here are the 4 steps to reparenting yourself while parenting your kid. Number 1, first you got to notice when you're triggered. I notice when I'm triggered. A trigger is like essentially a disproportionate response to a situation. Essentially, I'm having a trauma response to a situation that's not actually traumatic. So, if my reaction is bigger or stronger than the event really merited, right, than you'd think maybe the average person would have here, then that's probably my inner child grabbing the wheel and having their own feelings that this situation that happened to them when they were a kid or him when he was a kid, and not actually about the situation. For men, and for me, this often comes out as anger, right? I get much angrier than is rational at the spilled milk, being interrupted, something being spilled or broken, right? My inner child was yelled at a lot for those things. And so now I'm essentially becoming that unconscious critical parent and yelling at my child, which is actually my own inner child getting yelled at, and repeating that behavior. So if I feel unworthy, like I'm messing everything up, I'm a fuck up, I can't do it, that was shit that I was told as a kid, right? And so if I'm telling myself that, like, oh, you're messing that up, or I'm hearing that from other people, that's a sign that my inner child has taken over, right? And now I'm essentially criticizing myself, like those adults did to me. If I withdraw instead of asking for help, this is usually me trying to protect my inner child, right? I'm overwhelmed. There's too much. I just need to get away, which is can be good to do, but also can shield him from getting the love and attention he needs also, right? If I just yank him away and pull him out every time there's a challenge and don't let anybody see him or ask for help, then that doesn't actually help him heal or get attention either. When I blame or criticize others, this is usually my wife or my kid, right? Anyone else, when I get in victim mode, as if I didn't choose this. Why is this so hard? Why is this all happening to me? How can they treat me like this? Why is my kid acting like this? It's not fair. How can my wife do that? This is me repeating the behavior of unconscious adults blaming me as a kid, right? Like I was blamed all the time for stuff. And so my inner child is very sensitive to being blamed and therefore likes to blame others to try to say, it's not my fault, it's their fault. even if nobody was actually blaming me in the first place. Sometimes I hear my mother or father's voice come out of my mouth, right? I say words that I swore I'd never say, such as because I said so, right? Almost never say this, but like it's come out of my mouth a few times. I'm like, whoa, I promised I'd never say that. I don't believe that. Why did I say that? This is unconscious words, right? Means some other part of my trauma or conditioning is taken over. And then finally, if I'm becoming way overwhelmed faster than expected, like my kids' needs or my partner's needs are just overwhelmingly like it's too much. I can't take it. I'm incapable of handling this. This is my inner child essentially saying, I'm at a breaking point. I'm at collapse. You can't keep going without giving me some support. Number one, you got to learn to notice it. Those are all signs. Number two, in the moment, I had to learn to pause. Okay, I notice I'm triggered. One of those things is happening. Now I need to take some time. There's where I have to identify that I'm reacting from trauma. This is not about the situation. It's not about my kids, not about my wife. I have to take a break. So I have to tell my kid or my wife that I'm upset, I'm triggered, I need a break. Being vulnerable like that is really, really hard, but they really respect it when you do it. And it's a really great model for your kid to see you do that. And they, of course, would much rather you take a break and give some space than to yell at them or to continue to act that way. So they're happy to do it. But man, this was just the really hardest thing for me. Noticing it at all was hard. But then when I started to notice it, admitting it and saying I need this was really tough. Like as if I was like I was embarrassed that I got triggered. So instead I'd try to just like hide it or muscle through, or I was like felt like weakness, like needing a break or having this happen to me was like meant I was something wrong with me that I couldn't just muscle through. So I had to learn to just be that strength. It was courageous and strong to admit that I'm triggered and take a breather. So in that break, now that you've asked for the break and you're taking it, take deep breaths, try to connect with, I try to connect with myself and I try to feel all my feelings. Ultimately, there's my little inner child's having feelings, just like my toddler, when they have tantrums, that's what's happening. He's having a feeling. And so I do treat that the same way I treat my toddler, which you can learn more about in the toddler tantrums episode. But it's essentially just naming feelings. Hey, you're feeling angry. Yeah, I hear that. You're feeling sad. You're feeling stressed out. It makes sense you would feel that way. It's totally normal to feel that. It's okay to feel angry and sad. You can feel those feelings. You're safe to feel those feelings. It makes sense. And you just do that over and over, giving essentially your inner child empathy. Like, here, you're triggered. You're upset. As long as necessary to get back to some kind of equilibrium. And then you can go back and re-engage, whether you apologize or whether you just kind of pick up where you left off, but from a more grounded adult place, not from a reactive, triggered trauma place. And if you, in that time, you identified something specifically you need to help you here, you can ask for that now. You can say like, hey, I realized I was upset. It wasn't about the spilled milk. I was trying to get this other thing, but if you would help me clean it up, that would be great. Or, if you could just turn the volume down a little bit, whatever it is, you can ask for it. So that's number two, right? Taking the break. Now, outside the moment, number three is healing your trauma, which of course you can't actively heal it while you're in the triggered state in that moment. The best you can do is take that break and then re-engage. But outside the moment, you can heal this. Trauma or PTSD is an injury like any other, can be healed permanently. Now, this was huge for me to discover this. I thought that all the trauma I had, I just had to live with, that I was basically going to be crippled for life. And the best I could do was be really good on crutches. When I discovered, oh wait, I can permanently heal this trauma. I don't have to be triggered by these things anymore. It's not a part of who I am to be triggered by, for instance, my wife walking away in a fight. Like, she is a runner. She'll need space. She wants to leave. And that used to trigger the fuck out of me. Like, I would just feel abandoned. I'd try to chase her and I'd get even madder. And now I healed that fully through the therapies I'm going to talk about in a minute, fully healed this idea. Now, if we're upset and she says, hey, I need space to walk away, I'm grateful for that. I'm like, okay, I don't want to be dealing with you when you're triggered, and I know that you're going to come back. And now I have an opportunity to heal, to get grounded and feel my own feelings, and then we can reengage. And so that was huge. There are still some things that I haven't fully healed, but I believe that I will. For instance, the perception of being criticized. If I think someone is criticizing me, I just get so worked up about that. Even if it's like really subtle, or half the time my wife wasn't even criticizing me. She was just commenting on something. And so I'm still working on that one. But I believe that I will heal it. It will not be forever that I am triggered by anything that sounds like a criticism. Now, healing doesn't mean that I have no reaction. It just means that I have a proportionate reaction. I'm still sad when my wife walks away in a fight, or maybe even angry about it, but it's not like explosive. It's not super crazy. And I don't do irrational things like try to chase her or, try to throw something, so it's a more of a proportionate response. Now, how do we heal? Trauma, PTSD, can be healed. There's two different kinds. There's just sort of regular PTSD, and then there's complex or chronic PTSD. Regular PTSD is from a single incident, like a car accident or somebody close to you dying or like a really bad breakup. That can be healed fairly quickly through my favorite treatment is called EMDR, where they activate the left and the right sides of the brain with little clickers or this little thing you watch. And like 4 or 5 sessions, you can like permanently heal PTSD from that and stop any symptoms that are related to that. Now, chronic or complex PTSD is much harder. It's that's trauma that's happened over years. For me, I was, as an undiagnosed autistic kid, I was bullied and assaulted and punished for most of my childhood, many, many years of trauma that I have. So that's a little harder to do, but again, can be fully healed. My favorite treatments for those, what's been really working for me, is somatic therapy. This is a therapy technique that reprograms my nervous system to no longer respond to certain triggers, and really powerful way to work with the nervous system. It also teaches me more emotional and physical awareness of my body and my feelings. So I learned these tools I can use, and it like just is reprogramming my nervous system. And then I've been really benefiting from psychedelic therapies. This is a fairly new science, but advancing very, very quickly, and a lot of FDA approved psychedelic therapies now, using like MDMA or ketamine or psilocybin. When done in the right protocol with a trained therapist, I've made a ton of progress on my chronic PTSD in just a few sessions, like even just one session, I am moving the needle. And so both of those have really helped me advance my trauma. But whatever works for you, there's, work with therapists, work with professionals, talk about your trauma. It can be healed. Now, number 4 is developing an ongoing relationship with my inner child. Very similar to how I develop a relationship with my actual child and nurture that and prioritize that. I have to do that with my inner child. And this was a really big thing for me to learn, that takes active care, not only just treating the injuries of the child, but having this active relationship. So my favorite tool for this is the 12-step program, ACA, which stands for Adult Children of Alcoholics. But it really works for anybody who came from any kind of dysfunctional family, like any kind of parenting that wasn't optimal for you. This program can really help develop your inner child. The cool thing is it's totally free. There are meetings, in-person meetings, in every city all over the country, including the world sometimes. And there's online meetings like every 15 minutes. So it's easy to find meetings. There's a ton of tools online, great books, other resources, including a book called The Loving Parent Handbook, which really helps you develop your own loving parent to help with your inner child, develop you with your inner child, with your inner teenager, and how to deal with that inner critical parent, which is usually running the show. So this program is scientifically proven to work. So it's a really powerful program. There's a few tips and tricks from that you can use right away. Like you can write a letter from your inner child to your adult self in crayon using your left hand or your non-dominant hand. This can help your inner child talk to your adult self about like what it likes and what it wants and what kind of parent it wants you to be. You could also do a voice note of that. You can also do this from your adult self to your inner child as well as a way to just talk to them. Uh, you can get a feelings wheel. So you can download this feelings wheel, or they sell pillows with the feelings wheel on it. That really just helps you identify feelings, know how to name the feelings your inner child's feeling or you're feeling. My wife and I use the feelings pillow before our meetings to really practice sharing vulnerably exactly the feelings we're having that day. Um, and then I can do things that your inner child likes. I try to schedule stuff for him, like going to movies, water skiing, mountain biking, making costumes. But more importantly, I have to remember that I'm bringing my inner child along with me on those things. So I have to let him enjoy it and really like put attention on him enjoying that experience and accessing my inner child in an active way. So now I just have regular conversations with my inner child. I call him little Joey. Talk to little Joey on a regular basis every day. I find all the parenting skills that I learned for Della work great for him, how to feel feelings and how to be present. I just have to remember to use it on him, not just on her or everyone else in the world, but to actually use that tool for my inner child. This also works very well for my wife's inner child. So you can bet that when she's triggered, having strong emotions, it's her inner child that's running the show. And so I can use this loving parent techniques, these tactics I use with my kid and I learn with myself for her inner child. And that makes our relationship even better. Doing this work is so liberating, right? My inner child is the one who experiences fun and feels joy and gratitude and loves playing with my daughter. You know, my daughter loves playing with him. My wife loves the way he lets her love him. So like doing this work it's just one of the greatest gifts that my daughter has brought me. And also, very challenging, but such a big opportunity to develop this inner relationship and be the best dad for my daughter, as well as for my own inner child. And then really the best man and the most engaged person that's, living this life now, feeling my feelings, not stuck in trauma responses, not repressing, not avoiding, but like actively engaging the world like my inner child was designed to do, right? He was designed to engage in this world and have lots of feelings and go on adventures, get hurt, have joy. That's what he was built to do. That's what my daughter's built to do. And that's the way I get to live now. So thank you, Della, for teaching me that. Thank you, Serenity, for also modeling this with your inner child work you've been doing. And if you found this valuable, please share with another dad in your life. Please subscribe to my channel. That really helps me reach more dads, and stay dedicated.